As a companion to the first video that I posted for Unit 3, I wanted to give you some quick tips on constructing a basic needs assessment. Most of this information will also coincide with what you can find on the Community Toolbox, particularly in Chapter 3. Most of the information that I'm going to share with you is to help you prepare for your assignment for Unit 3. At the same time, it also gives you a good overview of some things to think about when it comes to designing basic needs assessments. In terms of constructing a good assessment, you really need to start off with a clear research question. What is it that you want to know about health? Do you want to know where people buy their food? Do you want to know how people seek out assistance with family planning? Do you want to know how people make decisions when it comes to mental health? Do you want to know where people seek out drug treatment? All of these things are really guided by your basic research question, and anything about your needs assessment will flow from having a very clearly articulated question that helps you set the goals for the assessment. In addition to being clear with your research question, you really need to see what's out there already. As I mentioned in the previous video, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are many great assessment tools that have already been designed that will help you figure out some basic needs for the community that you're working with. I would encourage you to consult sources like the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, also looking at resources for your county level health department. Community Toolbox itself also has some good resources. In this class already, we've mentioned a couple of established health research tools that are out there. For example, in the previous video, I mentioned the National College Health Assessment. In Unit 2, we talked about a couple of different tools that are used to assess health literacy, including the Test of Functional Health Literacy in Adults and the newest vital sign. So again, there are a lot of great resources that are already out there. You might start off by looking for them with a simple Google search, but most likely you're going to have to get a little bit more detailed and a little bit more thorough in terms of the established health research tools that are out there. When it comes down to it, you really need to choose the best tool, not just the easiest tool to get your hands on. When it comes to answering these questions, you want to make sure that you're doing a really thorough job of assessing needs up front so that you can design the best possible health communication resources later on. It might be tempting to ask a couple of quick questions on a simple survey. However, most of our health issues require a much more nuanced assessment when it comes to understanding what it means to be healthy. In this video, I'm going to give you some specific tips that focus on constructing interview questions, focus groups, and surveys. To get things started, let's talk about interviews. Interviews are probably best for when you want specific and detailed information about a topic, and they're good for obtaining information from individuals, groups, or organizations about that specific health issue or need. They're especially helpful when it comes to designing health programs for specific groups of people. If you're not trying to get information that can be generalized to a larger population, interviews are often the way to go. They're a nice kind of face-to-face conversation between you and a participant to get a sense of what they really need in order to achieve their ultimate health state. Upsides of interviews are that they can get you that really detailed and specific information. But some downsides are that it often takes a long time to collect that information, especially from a larger group of people. When you're doing one-on-one interviews and you're the only interviewer, it can take a lot of time to get through those questions with multiple individuals, groups, or organizations. But interviews can get you some really rich information, so let's think about constructing good interviews. First things first, and this is true for interviews, focus groups, and surveys. You need to ensure confidentiality for your participants. You're talking about health information, and a lot of times that health information is protected by certain policies out there, like HIPAA, which you read about in the Dupre text. You also want to make sure that your participants are comfortable sharing information with you, and that insurance of confidentiality can really take you a long way. after you think about confidentiality and how you are going to ensure that for your participants, another thing that you need to focus on is the actual design of your interview questions. So here are some quick tips that I have. First of all, things to avoid. You want to avoid yes-no questions. If you ask a yes-no question, you're going to get a yes-no answer. You want to ask the kinds of questions that are going to get you a lot of detailed information, and yes-no questions just don't cut it. Sometimes you do have to ask a yes-no question because you need a yes-no answer. But when it comes to doing an interview, you always want to have a follow-up question for a yes-no. So asking them why they answered either yes or no to that question. You also want to avoid loaded questions. Loaded questions often have an assumption buried in the asking of the question itself. You never want to assume anything about your research participants. You want to ask questions in a way that allow them to speak for themselves. And so asking a loaded question that has some sort of assumption already built into it can really shut down that interview before it gets started. As I mentioned previously, you want to be careful about questions regarding sensitive health information. Not only do you need to ensure confidentiality, but you need to craft your questions in a way that your participants are going to understand why you are asking that question. Or at the very least, you need to be prepared to answer that question when they ask you, why are you asking me this question? Because you're talking about what it means to be healthy, because you're often asking questions about sensitive health topics, you need to think about that in terms of how you actually phrase the questions themselves. And then finally, don't ask too many questions. You want to make the best use of your time and your participants' time. So you want to make sure that you ask the fewest number of questions that will get you the most possible information. It's a tough balance to strike. Oftentimes, when I am writing an interview guide, I will ask about 10 basic questions and include some follow-up and probing questions for each of those 10 questions. A lot of times that will get me through about an hour-long interview, but sometimes people will answer those questions in 10 to 15 minutes. So you've got to be prepared to, again, make that best use of your time and your participants' time and balance the number of questions that you ask accordingly. When it comes to the things to include in your question design, one of the things that I always like to include is a grand tour question. And those are questions that can really get your participants talking. Grand tours ask participants to describe an average day dealing with their disease or their health issue. It asks them to design their ideal healthcare system. Again, it's asking them to kind of give that grand tour, some sort of grand narrative about their particular health issue. These types of questions get your participants talking because it asks them to describe something that they're very familiar with. When it comes to asking good interview questions, you want to ask as few questions as possible, and you want your interview participant to do most of the talking. And those grand tour kinds of questions can really get that going. In terms of keeping you on track during the interview, I always recommend using an interview guide that includes the questions, follow-ups, and probes. Your questions really make sure that you're hitting the high points of all the information that you need. Follow-ups are oftentimes an additional question, like if you have to ask a yes-no question, you always want to ask a follow-up question of why. Or if you're asking a question that kind of gets your foot in the door about an issue, you might use a main question to get that foot in the door, but then a follow-up question to dig a bit deeper. That's where we also get into probing questions as well. Probing questions really encourage that process of digging a bit deeper into the interview process. You might have to start off with some softball questions, then include a couple of follow-ups, but as you get into conversation with your interview participant, you can oftentimes encourage them to probe deeper on some of the information that they're sharing in response to an individual question. And finally, you want to construct interview questions that help you get at that primary research question that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. Anything that you're collecting as part of a needs assessment needs to go back to that original research question. What is it that you're really trying to figure out? And are your interview questions actually getting you the information that you need to act upon that research question? Overall, I really like interviews as a way to conduct good needs assessments from a qualitative perspective because they allow you to get that really rich, detailed information from individuals who are actually dealing with the health issue that you want to address. In many cases, you're also able to start building a relationship with your research participant, especially if they're going to continue with you along your health project, if it's a health campaign, if it's a message design, or again, even if it's talking to your family and friends about a health issue that they need to address. I'd like to offer some additional details about a specific type of interview called the focus group interview. Focus groups are for when you want detailed information about a topic from a specific group of people. Maybe you are interviewing a group of people because they are all college students. Maybe you're interviewing a group of people because they all are dealing with the same health issue or the same health need. Maybe you're interviewing people because they're all men or all women or all over the age of 18 or all under the age of 18. You might also break up focus groups into different demographic categories based on things like race and ethnicity or immigrant status, so on and so forth. Again, it's about getting specific information from that group of people, and it's good for obtaining information in a small group setting from individuals who share some sort of trait or feature. That small group setting can get you some really powerful data in terms of conducting a needs assessment because not only are you getting information from the individuals themselves, but a lot of times during that small group interview, they'll bounce ideas off of each other and kind of co-construct knowledge and co-construct a way to talk about health needs in that focus group interview. A lot of the same rules apply to focus group interviews as they did to interviews that I outlined in the previous couple of slides. So I'm not going to rehash all of those rules here again, but I will highlight a couple of big differences to think about when it comes to doing focus groups. Sometimes it might be really tempting to do a focus group because you think, hey, why interview one person at a time when I can interview 7 people at a time? So one of the things that I encourage you to think about first is, why do you need to do an interview in a small group setting? If you've got a good reason for interviewing a small group to actually get the information that you need, then you should probably go ahead and use a focus group. But if you're using it just as a way to get a lot of information from a lot of people in a small period of time, and you don't want to have to do individual interviews, it might not be the best reason as to why you're doing a focus group. But if you've got a good reason for interviewing people in that small group setting, you've got a lot of challenges in terms of how and why you're going to recruit your small groups. What's the common trait that links people together that you're trying to study? Also, what are the logistics that you have to figure out in terms of recruiting people? Are you going to recruit them by phone? Where are you going to tell them to go? Are you going to have them use pseudonyms? There are a lot of specific logistics to think about, and Community Toolbox covers some of these details in a really thorough and meaningful way. So I would encourage you to follow up with Community Toolbox in terms of figuring out those logistics for how and why you're going to recruit your small groups for your focus group interviews. And finally, we have surveys. Surveys are best for when you need information from a lot of people about a specific health topic or a range of health topics. They are good for obtaining health information that represents an entire population or group of people to whom you're directing a health message. We're talking big picture with surveys, and there are some important rules that you have to follow in the survey construction process. Again, I would encourage you to go back to Community Toolbox. They have 2 sections in Chapter 3 that focus on constructing good surveys, and that will help you work out the details in terms of what I'm looking for in this assignment. Again, I've mentioned this before and I'll mention it again. You always want to check what's already out there. As I've mentioned, there are assessment tools like the National College Health Assessment, the Test of Functional Health Literacy in Adults. There are many resources that are already at your disposal. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. One reason that you always need to check what's already out there is not only to avoid reinventing the wheel, But in many cases, the surveys and the scales and the measurement tools that are already out there have been validated, meaning that you know you're getting good information whenever you use that assessment tool. It's reliable, it's valid, and you can be confident in the research results that you're getting when you use it. If you are going to start to design some of your own assessment tools, though, you want to be strategic about how you're using your questions. You want to be clear about what you're trying to measure. Are you trying to measure the number of fast food restaurants that are within a mile of a university? Are you trying to measure how satisfied people are with their healthcare providers? Are you trying to measure how likely people are to take a particular mental health treatment or mental health medication? Again, this kind of goes back to that idea of what kinds of survey questions will help you with your overarching research questions. You need to figure out what it is that you're trying to measure, because a lot of times that's what surveys are doing. They're measuring information, needs, behaviors, practices, and so you need to be clear about what it is that you're actually trying to figure out. Related to that, you need to figure out what kind of data is going to be useful to you. Do you want to use a Likert scale? And that's usually a 5, 7, or 9-point scale that encourages you to answer questions with answers like excellent, good, average, poor, very poor, or very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, not satisfied, very unsatisfied. You get a range of options with some sort of equidistance between each of those options. You might also ask on a scale of 1 to 10. You might ask questions where people rank order specific kinds of information. We can take a look at the Advanced Home Care Survey to see some useful kinds of questions to include on a survey, at least in terms of formatting. This first block of questions on the Advanced Home Care Survey features what we call a Likert scale. So it asks a question and then you're supposed to answer it in terms of the overall effectiveness of communication in each of the following areas. So you can rate it in terms of being very poor, poor, average, good, very good. Again, you've got that range of options, and the idea is that the distance between very poor and poor is probably the same as poor and average, between average and good and very good. Likert scales are very, very common on surveys. And again, you want to go and see, are there actual scales out there that have already been established that can help you assess the kinds of needs that you want to assess? Other kinds of questions that you might see on a survey include checkboxes. So in this case, they are asking, when company leadership has information to share, I prefer to hear about it via, and they're asking you to choose only one. The purpose of this survey is to figure out how to improve communication so that employees don't receive too much information and they actually read the information that they do receive. So asking them how they prefer to receive their information can be a really useful question on a survey. As you scroll down the survey, you'll notice other kinds of questions where in the survey they're basically asking one question: please rate the amount of information you receive in each of the following areas. But in essence, they're actually asking multiple questions because they're asking you to rate the amount of information that you receive about each of these points. And so when you're able to combine questions together in that way, you're able to make the survey much easier to take for the participant. They're answering, in essence, 10 questions about too little, about right, or too much in terms of the information that they receive in the following areas. If there's one thing I like about the Advanced Home Care Needs Assessment, it's that it gives you a lot of different kinds of samples of different kinds of questions. So when you're thinking about what kind of data is most useful for you, go to that survey as a way to think about, okay, how do I craft questions in particular ways so that I'm getting the right kind of data to make the decisions that I need to make? And again, most of what we see on the Advanced Home Care Survey goes back to their central question: how do they improve communication within their healthcare organization? And in order to answer that question, they need to figure out, well, what's the communication like and what do people need when it comes to different health communication messages? Some other tips I can provide you when it comes to constructing surveys involve the idea that not only do you need to be strategic about your questions, but you also need to be strategic about the order in which you ask them. Oftentimes, you want to open up with some easy questions that still get at the core information that you need. You'll notice that I did not say open with demographic information. A lot of times you want to keep demographic information at the end of the survey, just not at the beginning. Asking people to identify what their gender or their sex is, what their race or their ethnicity is, their age, their income level. Sometimes those questions can be a little off-putting, and people feel uncomfortable answering them right away. If you include demographic questions at the end of the survey, people will have started to get used to the questions that you're asking, and they might not mind giving that information as much at the end of the survey. Also, if they are going to have a problem with answering that demographic information, at least they'll have answered all of the other questions in the survey first, and so you'll still have some information that you can go on, even if they choose not to answer the demographic information. Additionally, I would also encourage, in the ordering of your questions, to ask them in blocks. Again, this is a spot where we can go back to the Advanced Home Care Survey as an example of what I'm talking about. The survey starts off with a first block of questions that is essentially 3 questions on a Likert scale. It moves on to a checkbox question. The next block of questions asks you to rate the amount of information you receive in each of the following areas. As the survey continues on, here's another checkbox. In fact, there are several of them on that page. This information starts to dig a little bit deeper and includes not just check a box kind of information, but also some open-ended questions as well. That's a decision that you have to make in terms of constructing your survey. Checkbox information is quickest, but open-ended questions can also get you some rich detail that you oftentimes don't always get on a survey. What you see throughout this survey is that the survey constructor asks different kinds of questions in blocks throughout the survey. This has a couple of positive benefits in terms of constructing a good survey. You don't want to ask a long list of the same types of questions, because a lot of times that ends up being really monotonous for a survey taker, and they stop actually reading the questions and just start checking the same box over and over again. If you change things up every once in a while and ask different questions in different formats, it really forces that survey taker to actually read the questions and follow the instructions and really be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of their answers. Related to that idea of breaking up the monotony, you also want to ask a question to make sure that your participants are actually paying attention. In many cases, it's not uncommon to see a survey that will say something like, check box 3, and that's all the question says. And really, the only reason the survey designer is asking that question is to make sure that the participant is paying attention and not just randomly checking boxes. It can help for some quality control on the back end of your actual survey design and instrument. As a whole, surveys can be really useful when it comes to getting a lot of information in a short amount of time about a large group of people. If you want much more detailed and specific information and rich data that's a little bit more narrative and descriptive, you might need to go with interviews. But surveys are still an excellent tool as long as you are, again, looking for what's already out there and being strategic with the questions that you're using. For all of these methods of needs assessment, interviews, focus groups, and surveys, I have a few final tips to give you. You always want to include a header and clear instructions on what the participant is supposed to do. If you go back to the Advanced Home Care Survey, they have a very straightforward example of what I'm talking about. They include a clear header that is a label of their survey, and they also include clear instructions about what the survey takers are supposed to do. In addition, I'd also like for you to specify who are your interview participants, focus group composition, and/or survey population. Are you going to do a focus group with people because they are all college students at a traditional four-year university? Are you going to interview participants who are living with lupus or some other health condition or disease? Are you going to survey a population of people who are providing social support for a family member who is currently in the hospital? Again, I'd really like for you to specify who is it that you're focusing on with this particular assignment and the needs assessment that you're designing. And then finally, you also need to specify a plan for conducting the needs assessment itself. How are you going to distribute your surveys? How are you going to recruit your participants for your interviews? Are you going to provide incentives? You always need to think through all of the logistics for planning and carrying out a needs assessment. Sometimes the process can be lengthy, sometimes it can be costly, and it always involves a lot of logistics. Long story short, don't just jump into a needs assessment. Take your time and figure out the best way to collect the information that you need. Figure out what's already out there in terms of existing assessment tools. Figure out the best way to ask the questions that you need information for, and then figure out how to get that information from participants in a way that makes the best use of both of your times.